You should have stayed in your courtroom. Your father built this empire brick by brick, and you are a nobody here.
Did you guys miss me?
The lights in the warehouse died first. Sung Tae-young felt the darkness arrive before he heard it, a pressure change in the air, the way a room feels different the instant before a scream. Somewhere above him, a single generator sputtered, and then a lone bulb flickered back to life, swinging on its cord, throwing shadows across 12 men who had all, until 60 seconds ago, called him boss. He counted exits. 2 both blocked. He counted guns. 5, that he could see, probably more in the dark beyond the light's reach. 3 months ago, Sung Tae-young had been a prosecutor with a spotless conviction record and a corner office that smelled of paper and ambition. 3 months ago, if someone had told him he would be standing in an abandoned shipping warehouse on the Busan waterfront, listening to the click of a hammer being drawn back, he would have laughed and gone back to his case files. Now he didn't laugh. He watched Han Tae-sik walk toward him with the loose, confident stride of a man who believed the story was already over. Your father built this empire, Han said, and his voice carried easily across the concrete. Brick by brick, blood by blood. And you. He gestured at Tae-young's tailored suit, the same kind he used to wear into courtrooms. You're going to lose it today, lawyer boy. Behind Han, the captains who had once knelt for Kang Do-hyun now stood with their arms crossed, waiting to see which way the wind would blow before they decided which side of history they'd be standing on. Tae-young's hand drifted instinctively toward his belt where there was no weapon, because he had never once carried one, not in 6 years of putting men like these behind bars, and not in 3 months of failing to become one of them. You should have stayed in your courtroom, Han said, almost gently now, the way you'd speak to a child before ending a game. He raised his weapon. And that was the moment, the exact moment, gun rising, breath held, no way out. Then the rear door of the warehouse groaned open, and a shape stepped out of the rain and into the light, moving with a calm that had nothing to do with fear. She had spent nearly a decade being underestimated. Called the help. Called quiet. Called invisible. Tonight, Abigail Maduka was done being invisible. How did a prosecutor end up staring down the barrel of a gun in his own father's crime family? How did the quiet woman who served his tea become the only person standing between him and death? And what happens in the next 60 seconds that changes both of their lives forever? Stay with me because to understand how we got to this warehouse, we have to go back. Back to a rainy night in Seoul, 3 months earlier, when a phone rang in a prosecutor's apartment, and a dying man asked his son to come home. Before we get into it, if you're the kind of person who loves a slow-burn romance wrapped inside a crime thriller, do me a favor and hit like, drop a comment telling me who you think Abigail really is, and subscribe so you don't miss where this story goes. Trust me, it gets better from here. Let's go back to the beginning. Seoul in late autumn was a city of glass and rain, and Sung Tae-young had built a life there that he was, if not happy with, at least proud of. He had a corner office on the 17th floor of the Central District Prosecutor's Building. He had a name that opposing defense attorneys said with a slight wince. He had, 3 years ago, a fiancée named Lee Soo-jin, before the wedding date had quietly disappeared from both their calendars, and neither of them had spoken of it since. What he did not have, had not had in 11 years, was a father. Kang Do-hyun had walked out of his son's life the summer Tae-young turned 21, right around the time Tae-young began to understand, in pieces, what his father actually did for a living. There had been no dramatic confrontation. Just a slow withdrawal, a series of missed calls, an ocean between them once Tae-young left for law school abroad. Tae-young told people his father had died years ago. It was easier than explaining that the man was alive, and powerful, and feared by people who did not scare easily. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Prosecutor Kang. The voice was unfamiliar, formal. This is Choi Sung-ho. I work for your father. He is dying. He has asked for you by name. I am told you have perhaps 2 days, if you wish to see him breathing. Tae-young sat in his dark apartment for a long time after that call, the phone still warm in his hand, rain streaking the window like the city itself was grieving something it didn't understand yet. He thought about hanging up on the memory of his father the way he'd hung up on so many of his calls over the years. He thought about the ring finger that still, occasionally, itched for a wedding band that had never existed. He booked a flight for the first morning departure to Seoul from Geneva, where he'd been 3 years into a fellowship on transnational financial crime, an irony so precise it felt scripted. He would spend the entire 11-hour flight telling himself he was going only to say goodbye. He would be lying, though he wouldn't know that yet. The convoy of black cars arrived at the estate gates a little after midnight, headlights cutting through sheets of rain that hammered the hillside like the sky itself was angry. Tae-young had forgotten how large the house was, a compound, really, walled and gated, more fortress than family home. He remembered climbing that stone wall as a boy, skinning his knee, his father laughing so hard he'd had to sit down. Inside, the air was thick with antiseptic and candle smoke and something else, the particular hush that surrounds a room where death is expected. 2 doctors exited as Tae-young approached the master bedroom, murmuring to each other, refusing to meet his eyes. A tall man in a dark suit, older, scarred faintly along one eyebrow, stood sentry at the door. Choi Sung-ho, Tae-young assumed. The man bowed, precisely 15 degrees, no more, no less. It was a bow that said, "I do not yet know if you deserve more than this." Inside, Kang Do-hyun lay small against white sheets. 11 years had turned a legend into an old man, skin gone the color of ash, hands that had once terrified boardrooms now trembling against the blanket. But the eyes, when they opened, were the same eyes Tae-young remembered from childhood, sharp, assessing, missing nothing. "You came," Do-hyun said. His voice was a whisper wearing the ghost of what had once been a command. "You're dying," Tae-young said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't gentle. 11 years of silence didn't dissolve because a man was finally afraid of the dark. A faint, rattling laugh. "Straight to it. Just like your mother." A pause, a labored breath. "I never wanted this life for you, Tae-young." "Then why call me back?" The words came out sharper than he intended, 11 years of unanswered questions compressed into 5 syllables. "Because there is no one else." Do-hyun's hand moved, slow and deliberate, to the nightstand drawer. He withdrew a heavy gold signet ring, its face worn smooth by decades on his hand, and pressed it into his son's palm with fingers that had gone cold. "They will come for you the moment I stop breathing. Every wolf who has waited 20 years for me to die. You will need this. You will need." He stopped, coughing, and for a moment something almost like tenderness crossed his ruined face. "You will need someone who tells you the truth. Find her. She is the only one in this house who never lied to me." "Who?" But Kang Do-hyun's eyes had already closed, and this time, when the monitor beside the bed began its long, flat tone, they did not open again. Tae-young stood alone in the room, a stranger's ring heavy in his hand, listening to the rain, and did not cry. He would wonder later whether that should have frightened him more than it did. They came from every province, men in black suits and darker histories, bosses of syndicates that controlled ports and casinos and men's lives, all filing past Kang Do-hyun's photograph with expressions of grief that Tae-young suspected were, for most of them, entirely performed. Respect was paid. Incense was burned. Bows were exchanged with the exact geometry of hierarchy. But underneath the ritual, Tae-young heard the whispers, the way you hear thunder before you feel the rain. "He's a prosecutor. He put men like us in prison for a living. He doesn't belong here. He never did. Give it 6 months. The empire dies with the old man." Han Tae-sik, tall, handsome in the manner of men who have never doubted their own charm, the second most senior man beneath Do-hyun, offered his condolences with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and a handshake that lasted 1 second too long, as if measuring the strength in Tae-young's grip and finding it wanting. "The organization is in shock," Han said smoothly. "Naturally. It will take time to know who can lead us now." Tae-young noted the word choice, the way he used to note contradictions in a witness's testimony. When the will was read that evening, in a study lined with books Do-hyun had never read and ledgers he'd read obsessively, the lawyer's voice was flat and final. Everything, the businesses, the debts, the loyalties, the enemies, passed to Sung Tae-young. No one in the room bowed. Choi Sung-ho watched from the doorway with an unreadable expression. Han Tae-sik's jaw tightened by exactly one imperceptible degree. And in the corner, refilling teacups no one had asked her to refill, stood a woman Tae-young had barely registered until that moment, quiet, dark-skinned, moving through the room like something that had learned long ago how to be furniture. He would learn her name that same night. He would spend the rest of his life wishing he'd learned it sooner. The guests were gone by 11. The house had the particular emptiness of a place recently full of people pretending to feel things. Tae-young sat alone in his father's study, surrounded by ledgers written in code he didn't understand, numbers that told a story he couldn't read. A soft knock. The woman from the corner entered, carrying a tray with tea, setting it down without a word, and moving to leave. Wait. Tae-young hadn't planned to say it. It came out anyway. She turned. Up close, her eyes were startling, dark, alert, entirely unlike the downcast servant's gaze he'd expected. Yes, Sung Tae-young SSI? You're reading the numbers. It wasn't what he meant to say, but he'd noticed the flicker of her eyes toward the open ledger on the desk, quick and involuntary, the way a trained eye cannot help but read. A small, careful smile. They don't make sense to you. No. They aren't supposed to. She stepped closer, and with a boldness that startled him more than her presence did, turned the ledger toward herself and traced a column of numbers with one finger. This isn't accounting. It's a language. Your father built it himself, 12 years ago, after a leak nearly destroyed him. Every real transaction is disguised as 3 false ones. Only he and one other person ever knew which one was true. Who's the other person? She looked up at him, and something in her stillness made the hair on his arms rise, not fear, exactly, but the recognition that he was in the presence of something far more significant than a maid pouring tea. My name is Abigail Maduka, she said. I have worked in this house for 9 years. Everyone believes I clean, cook, and stay quiet. I do all of those things. A pause, precise as a scalpel. I also know more about your father's empire than anyone left alive. Including you. Tae-young studied her for a long moment, the calm posture, the flawless Korean threaded faintly with a Nigerian cadence, the eyes that missed nothing. 6 years of cross-examining liars in courtrooms had taught him to recognize the particular quality of someone telling the truth even when the truth sounded impossible. Then I suppose, he said slowly, you and I have a great deal to discuss. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease. Neither of them noticed. They talked until dawn. In the weeks that followed, Tae-young learned that inheriting an empire was nothing like inheriting a house or a bank account. An empire had to be held, actively, daily, against dozens of smaller hands trying to pry pieces of it loose. Abigail became his education. Not in violence, she made that distinction clear the very first week, when he'd asked, half joking, half terrified, whether she was going to teach him to use a gun. Your father used guns exactly 4 times in 30 years, she told him, walking beside him through the compound gardens where they could speak without being overheard. He used people every single day. Guns are for men who have already failed at everything else. So she taught him people instead. She taught him Choi Sung-ho first, the old lieutenant, fiercely loyal to Do-hyun's memory, a man who had buried 2 brothers because of decisions Do-hyun made and had never once complained, because loyalty to Choi was not conditional on comfort. He will test you, Abigail warned. Not with violence. With silence. Watch what he doesn't say. She taught him the network of debts that held the organization together, not chains, she insisted, but threads, fragile and reciprocal. A restaurant owner in Busan whose daughter's surgery had been paid for 8 years ago. A dock worker whose son avoided prison because Do-hyun made a call. 100 small mercies extended not from kindness alone, but from the understanding that fear built empires quickly and lost them just as fast, while gratitude built empires that lasted generations. Your father ruled with fear, she told him one evening, the 2 of them alone in the study where their conversations had become a nightly ritual. but he kept everyone's children fed. That is the part people forget when they tell his story. Fear opens the door. It's the debt of gratitude that keeps people from walking back out through it. Tae-young, prosecutor to his marrow, had spent his career believing that fear and gratitude were opposites, that you built justice on one and corruption on the other. He was beginning, uneasily, to understand that his father's world operated on a far more complicated arithmetic, and that the line between the two systems was thinner than his law degree had ever taught him. His first real test came 3 weeks in, when a mid-level captain named Kang Il-sung, no relation, a common surname, owed the organization an amount that, in the old boss's world, was settled with a broken kneecap and a public warning. The captains gathered to watch what the new boss would do. Han Tae-sik watched closest of all, a faint smile already forming, anticipating either weakness or brutality, both of which he could use. Tae-young did neither. He forgave the debt. The room went silent. Even Choi's expression, normally granite, flickered with something like alarm. "You'll be seen as soft," Abigail warned him afterward, though her tone held no judgment, only information. "Han will use this. Let him." Tae-young had already thought this through, the same way he used to build a case, brick by brick. Kang Il-sung's daughter needs medical treatment that the debt would have paid for. If I break his knee, I gain a debtor who hates me and a story that makes me look like my father's shadow. If I forgive it, I gain a man who will die before he lets anyone move against me, and a story that makes every captain in this organization wonder if the new boss is smarter than they gave him credit for. Abigail studied him for a long moment, and for the first time, something warmer than professional respect crossed her face. "That," she said quietly, "was exactly what your father would have done. Only he would never have told anyone his reasoning. He would have let them wonder. Maybe I want them to know I have reasons." "Then you are already different from him," she said. "That may be exactly what this organization needs. Or it may be what gets you killed." Both, as it turned out, would prove true. Word spreads fast in a world built on information as currency. Within a month, rival syndicate bosses across Seoul and Busan were quietly recalculating their assumptions about Kang Do-hyun's untested son. A prosecutor who forgave debts instead of breaking bones was either a fool who would be devoured within the year or something far rarer, a leader building loyalty on a foundation no bullet could dissolve. Choi Sung-ho, watching his new boss navigate 3 separate territorial disputes without a single act of violence, began, cautiously, wordlessly, to change the way he stood in Tae-young's presence. The 15-degree bow became, without announcement, 20. Han Tae-sik noticed this too, and began, quietly, making calls of his own. It happened slowly, the way important things often do, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small ones. Abigail cooked one evening, jollof rice, rich with tomato and pepper, a dish from a childhood she rarely spoke of, and watched with unconcealed delight as Tae-young, a man who had eaten in Michelin kitchens across Europe, coughed his way through his first bite of Scotch bonnet. "You people put fire in your food and call it dinner," he managed, eyes streaming, and she laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the first he'd heard from her. "You Koreans put fermented cabbage in everything and call it culture," she shot back, and he found himself laughing too in his father's study, surrounded by ledgers written in codes he was slowly learning to read, feeling something loosen in his chest that had been clenched since the phone rang at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. The next week, he made kimchi jjigae for her. Badly, the rice was slightly burnt, the broth too salty, and she ate every bite without complaint, and told him 3 days later that it had, in fact, been terrible, and he'd laughed so hard he'd nearly knocked over his father's antique inkwell. In the space between those small kitchens, they began to talk about things that had nothing to do with ledgers or captains or debts. She told him about Lagos, about a mother who sold fabric in a market that smelled of diesel and orange peel, about a father she'd lost too young to a disease that better medicine might have caught. She told him, carefully, about the ship that had brought her to Korea 9 years ago, and the desperate arrangement that had first put her in Kang Do-hyun's household, though even then, Tae-young noticed, she left gaps in the story too neat to be accidental. He told her about law school abroad, about the 6 years he'd spent building his identity as far from his father's shadow as geography would allow, about Lee Soo-jin and the wedding that never happened, and how he still wasn't entirely sure whether he'd left her or she'd left him, only that somewhere in the space between ambition and grief, they'd stopped being two people building a life together. "Why did you become a prosecutor?" she asked him one night, the two of them on the veranda, the city's lights blurring into the dark hillside below. "Because I thought if I put away enough men like my father," he said slowly, testing the truth of it as he said it aloud for the first time, "it would mean I wasn't like him. That the distance was a choice, not an accident. And now?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Now I'm not sure the distance was ever the point." She didn't answer that. But she didn't look away either, and something passed between them in the silence that neither of them was ready to name. Lee Soo-jin found him on a Tuesday, 3 years to the week since their wedding had quietly evaporated, waiting outside the gates of the compound with a photographer's patience and a reporter's nose for a story too good to leave alone. Sung Tae-young, the prosecutor turned crime boss. That's a headline that writes itself. She didn't smile when she said it. Soo-jin had never been one for performative warmth, which was, Tae-young remembered, one of the things he'd once loved about her. "I'm not giving you a story, Soo-jin. I'm not asking for one. Yet." She studied him, the expensive but understated suit, the new watchfulness in his eyes. "I'm asking you to be careful. Han Tae-sik has been meeting with people he shouldn't be meeting with. People who used to only talk to your father's rivals." Tae-young felt something cold settle in his stomach. "How do you know that?" "Because it's my job to know things, same as it used to be yours." A pause, and for a moment the old warmth flickered, quickly extinguished. "I don't want to write your obituary, Tae-young. Watch your back." She left before he could ask how she'd gotten access to information that deep inside his own organization, a question he would very much regret not pursuing sooner. It was Abigail who told him, finally, on a night when the rain had returned to Seoul as if the city itself were marking time by it. They sat in the study, the ledgers between them, and Tae-young, sharper now, 3 months into an education he'd never asked for, had begun to notice inconsistencies even Abigail's explanations didn't fully account for. Access codes should only be known to the inner circle. A financial maneuver 8 years prior that had saved the organization from a hostile takeover, one Abigail described with a precision that went far beyond anything a housekeeper should possess. "You weren't hired as a maid," he said finally. "Not a question." Abigail set down her teacup with deliberate care, and for the first time since he'd met her he watched her decide, visibly, to stop protecting a secret she'd carried for almost a decade. "9 years ago, I was in Cyprus, on a business trip your father took to negotiate a shipping arrangement that went badly wrong." Her voice was even, but her hands, folded in her lap, had gone very still. "There was an attempt on his life. A poisoning meant to look like a heart attack. I recognized the symptoms. My mother worked with a healer in Lagos who taught me things most people never learn. I saved him. Barely. He never forgot it. In exchange, he asked me to come to Korea. Not as a bodyguard. Not as an advisor. That title would have made me a target, made every rival ask why a boss trusted a foreign woman with his secrets. So he made me invisible instead. The maid's identity protected me and the information I carried. Nobody suspects the woman refilling teacups of sitting behind a curtain at every confidential meeting for 9 years, memorizing every word." Tae-young absorbed this in silence, the pieces of the last 3 months rearranging themselves into a different, sharper picture. "So when my father told me, on his deathbed, to find the one person who never lied to him, he meant me." Abigail met his eyes without flinching. "I have never lied to you either, Tae-young. I told you exactly who I claimed to be, an employee of 9 years who knew the organization intimately. Every word was true. I simply let you believe the smaller version of it, until you were ready for the whole." "Is there more?" he asked quietly, some old prosecutor's instinct telling him there was always more. Abigail hesitated, a fraction of a second, but he caught it, the way he'd once caught hesitations in witnesses that told him exactly where to dig deeper. "There is always more," she said finally. "But some of it isn't mine to tell yet. Trust me a little longer, Tae-young. I have earned that much, I think." He wanted, very badly, to trust her completely. He would learn, Soon enough, exactly how dangerous and how necessary that trust would turn out to be. It was Abigail, 3 days later, who raised the question that would unravel everything. "Your father's death," she said carefully, over breakfast, watching him with the particular stillness she wore when delivering information she knew would hurt. The doctors called it heart failure. Sudden, complete organ decline. I have seen that pattern once before. Tae-young set down his chopsticks. Cyprus. The same symptoms. Slower this time, administered over months, not days, which is why no one questioned it. A man his age, his stress, his habits, heart failure surprises no one. Her jaw tightened. But I know what a slow poisoning looks like, Tae-young. And I think someone in this house has known how to do this for 9 years, because I am the one who taught them how to recognize it, back when I was trying to protect your father from it happening again. You think someone who was in the room that night in Cyprus is still in this house? I think, Abigail said quietly, that someone has been planning this for a very long time, and that they are not finished. They didn't have long to wonder who. Han Tae-sik requested a meeting 3 days later, full council, all senior captains, at a warehouse on the Busan waterfront that the organization used for sensitive negotiations, chosen specifically, Tae-young would later realize, because its concrete walls swallowed sound. Alone, Han specified when Tae-young's assistant asked whether Choi should accompany him. This is a matter of trust between the boss and his captains. Bodyguards send the wrong message. Abigail's face, when she heard this, went carefully blank in a way Tae-young had learned meant she was frightened and refusing to show it. Don't go. If I don't go, I've already lost. A boss who's afraid of his own counsel isn't a boss. Tae-young. I have to. He took her hand, the first time he'd done so without hesitation, without the careful distance they'd both maintained even as the distance had worn thin. But I need you to trust me the way you asked me to trust you. Whatever happens tonight, I need you to be ready. She looked at him for a long moment, something fierce and frightened and entirely unguarded crossing her face. I have spent 9 years being ready for exactly this kind of night, she said finally. Go. I'll be close. The warehouse smelled of salt and rust and old diesel. 12 men stood in a loose circle beneath a single swinging bulb, and Tae-young understood, the moment he stepped inside and heard the door lock behind him, that this had never been a council meeting at all. Han Tae-sik smiled like a man who believed the story was already written. Your father built this empire, Han said, spreading his arms to the assembled captains as if presenting evidence to a jury. Brick by brick, blood by blood. He gestured at Tae-young's suit, you're a lawyer wearing a dead man's ring. You'll lose it today. You poisoned him, Tae-young said. Not a question. He'd spent 6 years learning to read the exact moment a man's confidence cracked, and he watched for it now. In Cyprus, 9 years ago, and again these last few months. You've known how the whole time, because you were there when Abigail saved his life the first time, and you paid attention to how she did it. Something flickered across Han's face, not guilt, but irritation, the look of a man annoyed that his masterpiece had been identified before the unveiling. Clever. Your father's genes, after all, wasted on legal briefs instead of business. He raised a hand. Weapons appeared from beneath jackets, more than Tae-young had counted on entering. Doesn't matter now. In 5 minutes, there will be no prosecutor's son to inherit anything. The first shot went wide, a warning, or perhaps simple nerves among the captains still deciding whether they wanted blood on this particular decision. Tae-young dove behind an overturned crate as the warehouse erupted into gunfire and chaos, men shouting, the disciplined lines of the meeting collapsing into pure animal confusion. And then the rear door tore open, and Abigail stepped through it into the swinging light, moving with a precision that belonged to someone who had trained for violence long before she'd ever poured a cup of tea. She fired twice, disabling rather than killing, shoulders, hands, the calculated mercy of someone who understood that dead men can't answer questions later. 3 of Han's shooters went down in the space of 4 seconds. The rest hesitated, and hesitation, in a gunfight, is its own kind of death sentence. Tae-young watched her move through smoke and shadow with something between terror and awe, understanding finally, completely, the full weight of what his father had built in her, Not a maid, not merely an advisor, but a weapon so carefully hidden that even he, watching her every day for 3 months, had never seen the blade beneath the silk. 9 years, she said afterward, to no one in particular, reloading with hands that didn't shake, and you thought I only knew how to read ledgers. Han tried to run. He made it exactly to the rear doors before Choi Sung-ho, who had, it turned out, followed at a discreet distance the entire evening, suspicious of the meeting's terms from the start, stepped out of the darkness and put him on the ground with a single, efficient blow. Tae-young stood over him, breathing hard, adrenaline still roaring through his blood, and felt every prosecutorial instinct he'd spent 6 years honing rise up against the older, colder logic of his father's world. "Kill him," one of the surviving captains muttered. "It's what your father would do." Tae-young looked down at Han Tae-sik, bleeding, disarmed, utterly at his mercy, and thought of every case he'd ever built, every conviction he'd ever won with evidence instead of bullets. "No," he said. "We're going to do this properly. He's going to answer for what he did, to my father, to this organization, in front of every captain in this room, with evidence, not bodies." If you turn to Choi, "Bring him to the council chamber. Everyone will hear exactly what he did and why." Every captain in that room fell silent. And in that silence, something shifted, not fear this time, but the dawning recognition that they were watching the birth of something the old world had never quite managed to produce. A boss who could win a gunfight and still choose the courtroom. The confession, when it came easily. Han Tae-sik was a man who had built his ambitions on other people's fear, and fear, once broken, rarely holds its shape. He had been in Cyprus 9 years ago, one of Do Hyun's junior lieutenants at the time, and had watched Abigail save the old boss's life with an intimacy of medical knowledge that told him exactly how a man like Do Hyun might one day be killed without anyone the wiser. He had waited 9 years, patient as rust, building alliances, learning the slow poison's exact dosage from a corrupt pharmacist in Incheon, waiting for the old boss's guard to weaken with age until the method Abigail had once used to save a life became the method he used to end one. "I would have been a better boss than either of you," Han spat, restrained now in the council chamber, surrounded by captains who had, only hours earlier, been willing to watch him take Tae-young's life. "Fear built this empire. Fear is the only thing that holds it together." "My father thought that too, for most of his life," Tae-young said quietly. "It's the last thing he taught me before he died, that fear opens doors, but only gratitude keeps them from closing again. You built your entire plan on fear, Han. That's why, in the end, you had to poison an old man slowly enough that no one would notice, instead of earning his throne the way everyone in this room actually respects." Choi Sung-ho, standing at Tae-young's shoulder, spoke for the first time that night, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who had served 2 masters and finally found one he believed in without reservation. "Today," he said, to the assembled captains, "you became your father's son. Not because you won a gunfight. Because you chose justice over blood, even when blood was easier." Han Tae-sik was handed over to the authorities the following morning, not executed, not disappeared, but delivered, with evidence carefully assembled the way Tae-young had once assembled evidence against men exactly like him, into a system that would take considerably longer to punish him than a bullet would have, and would do so, Tae-young insisted, in a way his father's world had never once managed. Publicly, accountably, completely. The captains who had wavered during the ambush knelt before Tae-young the following week, not out of fear this time, Choi observed, but because they had watched a man refuse the easy cruelty available to him and found, to their own considerable surprise, that they respected the harder choice more than they'd ever respected fear. In the quiet that followed, the funeral rites finally allowed to settle, the organization stabilizing under captains who had, at last, stopped testing their new boss and started simply serving him. Tae-young found Abigail in the garden where they'd first begun truly talking, months earlier, and asked the question he'd been circling since the warehouse. "You said, the night you told me about Cyprus, that there was more you couldn't tell me yet. Is now the time?" Abigail studied him for a long moment, and then, for the first time since he'd known her, allowed something like vulnerability to surface fully in her expression. She looked at him fully now, no walls left between them. "I have spent 9 years being extraordinary in secret, Tae-young. I would like, for the first time in my life, to be extraordinary somewhere people can actually see it. Where will you go now? Tae-young asked, though something in his chest had already begun to ache at the question, at the assumption buried inside it, that she would go anywhere at all, that this ending required her leaving. Abigail smiled, the careful, guarded smile giving way, finally, to something entirely open. Somewhere peaceful, I imagine. I've spent 9 years in service to a war I didn't start. I think I've earned a little peace. Tae-young took her hand, the second time now, and this time neither of them pretended it was anything other than exactly what it was. Then let me come with you, he said. Wherever peaceful turns out to be. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. The garden was quiet, the city's lights blurring gold against the evening beyond the compound walls, and somewhere in that silence, 9 years of hidden strength and 3 months of unexpected inheritance folded together into something neither of them had planned for and both of them, it turned out, had wanted for longer than either would admit. I should tell you, Abigail said finally, laughter threading through the words, that I have very strong opinions about which parts of this empire are worth keeping and which parts we're going to burn to the ground. I would expect nothing less, Tae-young said, from the only person my father ever trusted completely. The months that followed were not, in the end, the stuff of easy fairy tales,